Though they find themselves in similar emergency situations, there are differences in how fire rescue, EMS, and law enforcement professionals perceive and experience not only what's going on around them, but how they should respond to it. We'll speak with a mental health professional who has experience in fire rescue, EMS, and law enforcement. Up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each episode, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk Psych Health and Safety.
Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. We're continuing our National Fire Prevention Month focus in this episode, but with a twist. So conversations about psychological health and safety in emergency services can have a different cadence, especially when focusing on fire rescue, EMS, or law enforcement experience. Though EMS, fire rescue, and law enforcement personnel respond to the same incidents, the same emergencies, the same disasters, they often walk away with different perceptions based on the roles that they held, based on the work that they were expected to do. And this difference in their experience also results in different lasting impacts to these experiences. And it's rare to find not only people who see the incidents from multiple perspectives, but can also view the human beings in a different way, in that they've been in that person's shoes and understand a bit about what the person is experiencing. So that's a wonderful kind of intro to our conversation today. It's an honor to talk to someone who does have that unique perspective. We were having a conversation before I push record about the fact that I know lots of folks in the fire rescue industry. I know folks that are in the EMS industry. I know folks that are in law enforcement, not as many. And I know lots and lots of folks who have background, expertise, education in psychology. But it's just rare to find people, or in this case, an individual who's done all that. So let's start with an introduction from my guest, by my guest, with my patented question: who is Dr. Ed Sherman?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Daniels. I do appreciate the invitation to be here and to join you for this conversation today. So, as you have alluded to, my background enters into all of those areas that you mentioned. And I'll start sort of in a chronological way and say that I like to say, only half jokingly, that I grew up in a fire station. And the reason that occurred was that my father was a firefighter. And a lot of young people are keen to see what goes on in the fire department and see fire apparatus and see what firefighters do. So I had a unique opportunity over time to be at a fire station and to be part of that and to see what went on at an early age. So that was certainly influential for me. And as it happens, my father was both a firefighter and a law enforcement officer in his career. So perhaps it's not entirely surprising that I became a firefighter and a law enforcement officer in my career. So to this point, from when I actually started in public safety, I have been involved in the field for 46 years, and that includes law enforcement, fire service, and EMS. Also during that time, I had an interesting opportunity to work specifically in local government risk management. And that local government risk management experience allowed me to be very directly involved in the health and safety realm and to try to determine how to make workplaces safer, to the extent that it is possible to help people and to have processes and procedures and ideas and thoughts around what is safety and how do we maintain that. So, lastly, I'll say in terms of sort of the introductory piece, I have a master's degree in both management and in psychology, and I also have a doctorate in clinical psychology in addition to that.
Wow. 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 Well, so we could actually, for some people, might walk away and go like, "Wow, I just how does a person have time to do all that stuff?" But we're gonna dig into a little bit more detail because each of those areas have some uniqueness to them that I'd love you to be able to share. So, but before we do that, though, another of the standard questions that I ask everyone who comes on, because I'm interested in the perspective, is when you hear the phrase or the term psychological health and safety, what does that mean to you?
I think, like most people, if I break it into two parts and look at the health and safety part, and even in my experience, my exposure where people were talking to me about health and safety and where I was talking to them or offering ideas or suggestions or advice, the health and safety part probably comes down to promoting wellness, at the very least, minimizing injury and illnesses, certainly related to the work environment. And so I think that is sort of a given in the sense that I think that people don't need a whole lot of explanation to know what that part means. But when you attach the word psychological to it, I think it may be an unfamiliar term and one that they're not used to. And so if we think of psychological is as how do we think of things, then the question becomes how do we think of health and safety in the workplace? And the answer is, unfortunately, in many instances, we don't give a lot of thought in many occupations or professions to that. And so it's fabulous that you and others are spreading the word about this and that you're really discussing this as another aspect and making this health and safety more comprehensive. Because I like to think of it sort of in the sense of emergency or disaster preparedness. Over the years, I have taught many different classes on all kinds of things from earthquake preparedness to first aid, bomb threat, disaster preparedness, all of these things which we usually don't need to be too concerned about unless and until they happen to us. And then suddenly people are very interested in learning about those things and they want to know how can they get some training and some information about that. And I think the same thing may be true for health and safety as that unless we encounter it sort of personally or directly, we may not consider it that much. Now, certainly in the fire service, safety is critical and in all of public safety. But again, in a day-to-day sense, the question is how much are people thinking about is what I'm doing safe or am I exposed to hazards, so on and so forth.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting how we have these entire systems, and you talked about it a little bit in terms of the the classes that you taught, been around, the folks that you've seen who, there's a big discussion about an earthquake, particularly living out there on the West Coast. There's a tremor, and all of a sudden everybody's interested when many of the basics that we talked about, that we're going to talk about in all these industries, in fire, in EMS, and law enforcement, some of those things, if we did those every day, we'd be better prepared for the big one. Because they're building blocks, and it's really difficult to roll something out in the big situation that we have in practice. We're not going to be all that good at it anyway. So, let's go back in the Wayback Machine and talk a little bit about your experience in the fire rescue service. And I understand. So again, that you're based on the West Coast now, but you were in the fire service more so you started on the East Coast, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I did. I started on the East Coast, and that's where I got my initial training and experience, and then came to California and got some additional training and experience. And I have been involved in fire and EMS throughout my entire adult life. I continue to be today in one role or capacity or another. And even when I was a law enforcement officer, I was an EMT, I was part of a specialized emergency unit, and I tried to apply those skills in that setting also. So I have always found both the firefighting and the EMS components to be interesting. Some people who I talk to in the rescue services prefer one or the other, and I mean, it's each person's interest level as to what they devote to their training and education and experience. And I tried to pursue both of them simultaneously because whether that pager went off to say that there was a fire or a medical aid call or whatever the case may be, I was interested in it. I felt like it was something that was necessary and important and valuable to provide. And that gave me a chance as a first responder to really step into the role. The other thing that the fire service and EMS provided me, especially early in my career, was exposure to a lot of different things. I was in a fire agency that was in a suburb of New York City. It was a very busy agency. We got calls for every imaginable type of situation or incident. And so in the matter of just even a few years' time, I had been exposed to a great many things. So that gave me a really good grounding about public safety in general, but about the fire service and EMS specifically.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. And again, I don't know that I had realized it was the suburbs of New York City. That says a lot when you say that you're in the volunteer service. And again, having not done it, but having friends that sometimes the suburbs of New York City are way, 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 way busier than some of the small cities around the country, just because of that's how the system works. And it gives you, again, a lot of exposure to a lot of things. And wow. Okay, so you migrate out to the West Coast, get involved. And I understand that not only were you in basic EMS as an EMT, but you also went to paramedic school as well?
So that was before I left the East Coast.
Oh,
So
okay. Okay.
I very quickly, the moment that you can see that my interest was keen in all of these things. The moment that I turned 18, I became a firefighter. The
Okay.
moment that I was off probation, I applied for EMT school. And the moment that I was eligible to become a paramedic, I went through paramedic school.
Okay.
So I had the great opportunity to do all three of those in my formative years, so to speak, in the fire service on the East Coast before coming to the West Coast. And once I arrived in California, I went to my local community and got picked up rather quickly because I had these experiences and
Yes.
I could get right to work, so to
Right.
speak.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That is quite an opportunity to be able to, first of all, to know what you're interested in. And you mentioned, watching your dad, giving you a kind of model of, something to try. And so it sounds like as you try it out, you go, but there's more,
Mhm.
and there's more, and there's more. And so you're doing firefighting, basic and advanced EMS. You come out to the West Coast. You continue to be involved, and again, at some point, the seed that was planted, again, probably by your dad, says that you also get interested in law enforcement. So, chat with me a little bit about how that occurred. And again, it does sound like it's not as if you put one of these things down. You just picked up another one at the same time and just put something else into your toolkit.
Yeah, that's true. I might have been interested if such a thing had been in existence or I'd known about it. Some places in the country have public safety agencies where
They
there's
do.
sort of a cross-pollination of all these
They do.
different things that you might go to a fire one minute and to a burglary the next or something along those lines. And that might have been an ideal thing. But I following the sort of traditional path, after having been to fire and EMS academies, I was hired for the police department in San Diego, went through the police academy, became a law enforcement officer, learned that role and profession. And the interesting thing about that is that I didn't see it as an either or sort of dichotomous, I do this one or I do that one. I saw places for applicability of the things I'd learned in the fire and EMS realm in law enforcement, because of course you're responding to emergencies. Of course you're helping people in many different contexts. So to me, this was like building upon what I had learned, rather more so than like shifting gears to something different.
Right, right. Yeah, and the other, there are, and again, there are, as you mentioned, many communities who have decided, as a matter of fact, I have a guest I'll be interviewing soon who talks about how that you can put all these things under the same umbrella from a leadership perspective. And these aren't right or wrong. They just really exemplify the diversity of what communities are looking for. It's not, not every community wants to have a separate police department, fire department, but they don't want to do that. And then there are others, they have to do that. There's too much going on. They couldn't put it all under one umbrella. And it's not right or wrong. But ultimately, when that first person shows up at that incident or that emergency, whatever skills necessary, and to your point, often law enforcement officers can get places quicker because there's only one of them. So, and it's kind of sad sometimes to see them show up with no training whatsoever. They have no idea really what to do. And some of that is unfortunately kind of the turf battle that goes on between the fire guys and the law enforcement guys, and they're mostly guys, but kind of that, and it's not a conflict. It's what does this person need at the time, and can I help them? So that must have been a really, interesting situation to be able to provide that service. No matter what you went to, you were a little bit better prepared probably than most.
Yeah, I think that was certainly beneficial in being able to jump in almost any situation and have at least some tools in my toolbox that I could apply immediately.
Right, right. So would you say, so something that kind of comes to mind, would you say that in terms of how it's impacted you, I mean, you personally, is there one of those disciplines or a particular incident that got you most interested in psychology? Or was that kind of another just separate, is there something that stimulated that interest from one of those disciplines, or was it something that was kind of going on in the background all along?
I would say that they were parallel paths. So again, I'll kind of put all of the public safety things on one side and the psychology on the other of the two paths, and say that I had a keen interest to pursue everything related to public safety, and I wanted to experience those things firsthand, be able to try working in those professions, get every bit of training that I possibly could to learn what I could to help as best as I could. But I remember on the day before I graduated the police academy, I was at a bookstore, and I happened to be in the psychology section, and I was reading a psychology book. And it isn't that I wasn't interested in law enforcement. I was probably never more excited than, to have these opportunities and to be able to have this career path that I could do all these incredible things. So I was very excited about that. But simultaneously, I recognize something, or at least I believe something, and that is that the overarching goal of public safety is to help people. And I believe that we can help people if we can understand them as well as possible. And what I mean by that is we can bring to bear solutions if we can understand what's going on, what motivates them, how they perhaps got in a situation that they did, so that we can assist with offering services or resources. And the interesting thing about this is that in this day and age where, we like to use the term, particularly in the fire service, of like all risk or all hazards, right. Fire service is called upon to do so many things, and so is law enforcement. But fire service is called upon to do so many things that first responders need to have a lot of technical proficiencies and learn how to do various procedures and use specialized equipment. And, paramedics are, with their pre-hospital training, learning to do things that are tremendously advanced to be done in the field. But having said all that, those things are critically important skills. But I hope that in honing those and in fine-tuning them over time, that the human aspect or the interpersonal aspect stays there as well, to remember that it's great to be a master of one's craft and trade, but ultimately it is people who are affected by these things and are touched by these crises, and that's on both sides of the process. So both the people who are providing the assistance and the support, and the people who are receiving the assistance and the support, to recognize what impact do these events have on these people.
Mhm. Wow. Yeah, that's a rather grounding statement when you say it that way, because I think there's a tendency for all of us to get involved in things and want to become so technically proficient that we almost lose sight of the end game and the end goal, which, again, to your point, is to be available to help people. And I'm a believer that the first person I have to be able to help is myself. Because if I am burned out, stressed, don't know exactly what I'm doing and not feeling good about, my job, then it's really difficult to go out and press past that to do a good job for someone else. So that's really interesting. So again, in all of these situations, this seed was planted somewhere as you were coming up, and they just kind of all germinated at the same time. And you had different opportunity to water them all, and here you are. And I understand that you focus a lot of your efforts now on leadership, on kind of helping leaders take us. I will confess, I became a supervisor for the first time at 27 years old, and I'd never supervised anybody in my entire life. Never really been responsible for anything. But I took a test, and I did well enough to get promoted, and they put me in a fire station and gave me 2 people and said, do it. And that was it. And, all these years later, I think back to, wow. I mean, that was a lot of responsibility. And there's some days I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And a lot of it had to do with, it wasn't always about the people. Not always. It was about, well, I got these procedures. I got these things I have to do because they told me I have to do them. But it wasn't always. And eventually I started getting more focused on, on the people part. So talk a little bit about how you see these, how these, your experiences have interwoven into this conversation about leadership.
So that's a great stepping off point to talk about how do we learn things? How, as a person in a particular profession or occupation, how do we learn things? And you just alluded to the fact that you were given the role, the title, the position of supervisor, but what preparation did you have for that? And that's a fair question to ask for a lot of people who are moving into their first position supervising others. So let's tackle for a moment just the question of how do we learn things? And we can, of course, read a book, we can take a class, we can watch a video. There's lots of ways we can avail ourselves of information, which is wonderful. However, the question is that the way that we really learn to act upon things mostly? And I think it would be statistically correct to say a large percentage of the things that people do are based on what they see other people do. Right. So in essence, that modeling, as we call it, is that whether it's to how do I be a parent? How do I be a spouse? How do I be a firefighter, law enforcement officer, paramedic? Probably a lot of that involved watching someone else doing it. And certainly we learned from those people, and we may have learned very effective skills, but what we may not have done was sort of objectively evaluated them and said, did the actions of those people, whomever, not with the intention of criticizing, but with the intention of learning, did they produce the desired outcome or results? Were they effective? Did it work? Were they good at what they did? Because the risk is, and again, I will say, I believe from my own experience in working with people, but I think this would be supported by research that's been done. We're much more likely to repeat the things that we have seen in life than we are to change them. The one exception to that might be if something was egregiously bad or wrong, we might say, I don't want to go in that direction. I'm going to go in a different direction. But that also requires some conscious awareness of that. And sometimes we don't have a conscious awareness of that. We just do what we do. And so humans frequently perpetuate things, good, bad, or otherwise. But the thing that is valuable to think about in that respect is we are not prevented, so to speak, from learning more things. We have many opportunities if we are open to the possibility of change, if we are free to sort of relinquish the need to practice our habits over and over again and say, okay, I'm going to try something different and let's see what it produces. So then let's then back to your example, say you're a new supervisor. How do you know how to be a supervisor? Well, maybe it is simply emulating the supervisor you saw. Was that the best style? Was that the most effective style? And, I probably shouldn't use the word best because I don't like to say good, bad, right, wrong. I like to say, did it accomplish what you wanted to accomplish? And I think in human interactions, that would be getting along well with people, having them work collaboratively, getting things done, not being in conflict. So those are critical skills for leaders that they may never be taught in a formal sort of sense, and they may or may not learn by example and watching others.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Wow. No, I really love the non-judgmental language because I think that a lot of the underlying judgment in language can be a psychosocial hazard for people. So I come into this environment and someone tells me this is better than what I do, and I start looking at it. Well, is there something wrong with me? Well, maybe it's not better or worse. Maybe it's simply different. And again, to your point, what is the outcome we're looking for? One of the analogies I often share about leadership is about creating an environment so when you're on the road, heading down the road, you can get people to go along with you. Because if no one is going along with you, you're simply out for a walk. That's hardly called leadership if no one is going along with you. And often there is really a lot of focus on pushing people or dragging people, but not influencing people. Because folk, particularly adults, have choices as to whether or not they want to do that or whether or not they want to, you can have all the rules that you want. People don't still have to follow them because sometimes the consequence to me is such that it doesn't matter what the consequence is. I have a core value that says I won't do that. And nothing that there's no way you're going to convince me until you can help me see the benefit in it for me. So I just wonderful, like I said, language choices in terms of particularly on leadership. And again, to another point that you made, a lot of these we're simply repeating what we heard. We're repeating the words that we heard. We're doing it the way we saw it done. And, and I can say that of all the leaders that I had, there's a particular one. As a matter of fact, I lost him to cancer, about a year ago. And but I still remember I met him when I was in recruit school as one of my instructors, and he became a mentor for me over the course of years, and a good friend, and the big brother that I never had because I'm the oldest, But so I was fortunate enough to have someone to emulate who was a nice person, who was a smart person, who, again, well, it's not fortunate or unfortunate, but sometimes people get exposed to people who have their own traumas and issues that they've never really had the opportunity to recognize or address, and they simply get repeated from person to person to person. And again, there's not intent there. I haven't met very many people in public safety, and I don't know your experience, but most people who get into the public safety field, they really do want to help people. They do. That's why they do it. But sometimes, the way they go about it is challenging. It's very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, and to that point, again, we have to question why somebody does something, and the only reason we can really know that is if we find out by communicating. If we make assumptions or attributions that somebody is trying to be difficult or disrespectful or doesn't like us or whatever we may feel, which unfortunately many times is sort of our go-to to kind of pick the negative interpretation or belief about the situation, that may not be the case. And so the old style of management, and it still persists in many instances, of I give the orders and you take them. Yes, it's true that you may have the authority to do that, but would we truly call that person a boss or a leader? In order to be a leader, we would expect that people would want to willingly follow, not be compelled or have to follow. And that is through building a style that is positive and productive. And again, this whole notion of if we can move away from my way or your way, the right way, the wrong way, and say, what are we trying to accomplish here? If what we're trying to accomplish is, for example, to have an injury-free workplace, okay, that's identifiable. We know what that is. We can measure that. Are we getting closer to that, or are we getting further away? And if we're not getting closer to it, why? What's going on? How about if we have a dialogue? Imagine that. But again, historically, and I don't wish to criticize anyone's style, because each person has whatever style works for them. But what we know, and I will say it differently to the listeners and to the viewers of this program, is that think of your own experience. What would we prefer? Would we prefer to simply be told something? Now, I always make the caveat, particularly in emergency services, we're not talking about a crisis or an emergency where something has to be done instantly, because there are those situations, of course. But we're talking about majority of the time. Is there no room for discussion? Isn't it possible that there could be other ideas, that there could be a way of a coming together of thoughts in order to try to figure out how can we accomplish this in the way that we want? So that is a little bit less baked in, so to speak, to leadership in the sort of historic sense, which is, listening to people, evaluating what they say, giving them feedback, and then trying to still come to a decision about what do we do with that as a foundational piece, rather than simply saying, I as a leader am experienced and knowledgeable, or I have the title and therefore I can figure it out and I don't need to talk to people. Wow. That doesn't work out very well.
It doesn't. Yeah, there's a part of me that thinks too that even in those situations where a decision needs to be made that's life and death, that there is still often the opportunity. So again, two paramedics are working a patient, something happens, and the one medic is, taking a course of action, but the other medic says, have you considered this? And it to me, what's most important is really not the next action, but that everybody can question all the time, and we not have any issue with that, because two sets of eyes or four sets of eyes or 8 sets of eyes, particularly if those eyes do have background and training and experience, and otherwise they wouldn't be there. I mean, they really wouldn't. So it's important to be able to take in those bits of information, because I'm sure you've heard of the concept of task fixation, where we get so fixated, and there's a reason that we zero in on the patient, or zero in on the fire, zero in on the, on the assailant or what have you. And we kind of lose some of the things that are going on around us and need somebody to say, hey, did you notice that? And the question is it psychologically safe enough for someone? And I'll this comes to me right now, and I'm thinking that if it was more psychologically safe on the 28th of May, I believe, in 2020, when those police officers pulled George Floyd out of his car, that if it was a little bit more psychologically safe, that one of those junior people may have been able to say, hey, hold up, maybe we shouldn't, because it sounds like some of them were thinking that way, but that's just not the way it was done. And that turned into a whole thing. That could be a whole nother conversation. But these types of interactions happen all the time. And it's important that there be an environment where people can say, hey, I'm feeling something a little different, or I see something a little different. And we have that, just a couple of, it doesn't take long to decide what we are going to do. And it's not, well, I'm in charge. And, it's like a bit of a diatribe there, but you had me thinking, when we talk about even in emergency situations, how important it is for us to be able to share information that we might have.
So the question is, does somebody else see something or know something that would be valuable to know? You can think of a hazmat incident, and that the firefighter is aware of something inside of a building, and the incident commander may not know about that, or whatever the case may be. We could come up with many different examples, but you're right. Even in the case of an emergency situation, it is possible, or at least reasonable, to be open to additional data points, so to speak, because those could be very valuable. But it's a question of, what does the culture dictate, and is that the norm, and is that comfortable? And for example, if we go to our boss and we say, I'd like to make a suggestion, or I have a problem, or there's a concern or an issue, and we sort of feel rebuffed, the likelihood is probably diminished significantly that we're going to do that again anytime soon.
That's right. That's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So as you're out in the world, having these conversations with leaders across public safety, across, private industry, what is your assessment of how psychologically safe things are out there? I mean, it's a very broad kind of statement, but just in the circles that you run in, what's your assessment about where things are? I'll just leave that open. What are your thoughts about how the environment is in general with the folks that you're coming across?
Again, I think that the emphasis is oftentimes on technical proficiency in whatever role or occupation a person is in. And again, there's just like, let's talk about the fire service, endless practice and training, and that's fantastic. That's essential. We want it to be sort of muscle memory, where they know that they can jump right into a situation and know what to do, and that this has been practiced and they're going to do it flawlessly and so forth. But what I think there could be much more of is that cross communication through all levels, because it is certainly uncomfortable sometimes to say from a less senior person to a more senior person, or from a lower rank to a higher rank, have you thought of this, or have you considered that, or are we doing this the right way? Because then that is likely to produce conflict, and therefore people avoid that. And it also isn't exactly, I think, in most people's mind, the best advancement strategy, because then you may be seen as the person who is difficult or always questioning things. But the opposite is not good, and that is that hopefully everybody is empowered to, in every organization, by both word and deed, by their leaders' example, to step up and speak their mind if they see something. Again, not with the intention of being difficult, but with the intention of being productive and helpful, and causing or creating or influencing a better outcome. And so I would say I would identify that as perhaps one of the areas that could use the most fine tuning or improvement, is that the communication is so important. If you think about it, what can we accomplish as humans effectively without communications? Not a lot.
Not a lot. Yeah, not a lot. Wow. Yeah, you as you're talking about that, you took me in the Wayback Machine to when I made fire captain. Had a couple of firefighters working with me that had both been on the job longer than I had, and both were interested in getting promoted and never been successful. And so I told him, I says, I honestly, I only wanted to be a fire captain and a lieutenant and a captain so I could be a chief. And I was just out with it. I wanted to be a chief when I was in my 20s, just because I thought it was cool. I didn't really realize what the job was, but that's what I wanted to do. So I told him, I says, I'm going to be here for a few years, and that's really my goal. And but the thing that comes to me is that, particularly when we would do inspections and such, I tried to encourage them. I said, I only have one set of eyes, and I can only see. I'm talking to someone, and if you see something, if you are aware of an issue, please say something. Speak up. Tap me on the shoulder. Or, say, hey, Captain, you see this? And so it made us more effective as a team, because I had three sets of eyes to see things, and often I'd get people who they thought they could just kind of talk to me about it and nobody else would notice. And the guys would come back and go like, yeah, but there's this thing over there, So we're a more effective team. And, to close that story out, I was reminded of it recently. We all got promoted and left that fire station within about 8 months of one another, because we all got promoted. All of us did. And that is a very proud moment to be able to, and again, it wasn't necessarily what I did. It was the environment I created for them to be themselves. Because I couldn't take the test for them. I had to take my own. But because just create this environment says, look, I'm going this way. We're all seem to go this way. Let's all enjoy it. Let's get the most out of it. And I'm not at all intimidated by you seeing stuff that I can't see and don't see. You've got more technical expertise in that area probably than I do anyway. And again, so back to your point, it's just so necessary to get people to not always focus on the technical is important, but it's not the only thing. It's not sufficient just to be technically capable. Yeah. So as we start to wrap our conversation up, I mean, as you've learned more about just the psychology just about psychology in general, are there some themes that kind of follow? You talked about communication, being open. Are there other things that you try to share, particularly with leaders, to help them not only be better leaders, but feel better themselves? Are there some things from a psychological perspective that you tend to share with folks?
Yeah, two things that I would comment on that. First of all, so we've been talking a lot about being a technical expert or subject matter expert. When a person gets promoted, I can certainly say this for myself. When I first got promoted to my initial supervisory position, I was given really no training in the interpersonal part of it. So this creates a great degree of discomfort. I was sent for weeks to a training class on being a supervisor, which talked about policies and procedures and filling out forms and reports, but it talked nothing about how to work with or manage people. And so that's a really big point. And to even just be able to acknowledge that as somebody in a leadership position is important. But so I have what I call the 4 pillars of effective relationships. And I mean relationships in all senses, personal, professional, whatever the case may be. And that is cooperation. We have to work together with people, because if they don't want to work with us, we probably can't get anything off the ground. We can't do much of anything. Collaboration. That's the willingness to say, I'm going to work with you and we're going to try to figure it out. That's that piece of kind of putting our minds together and try to say, what can we accomplish together, rather than I'll get the glory or you'll get the glory. How about if we accomplish what we're trying to do here? The third one is communication, as we've been talking about all along. And the fourth one is trust. And so I like to say if one or more of those is missing, there's a good likelihood that the relationship, whatever type of relationship, is probably not going to work too well, or there's going to be difficulties. So that is like a foundational piece that I try to offer to leaders. The other thing that I try to offer to leaders is you can't be everything to everyone. And again, I kind of go back to the point I said before, which was to ask the audience members to think of their own experience. When we go to our boss and say, I have this problem, issue, or concern, do we really think that they should have all the answers and have them immediately? I don't think so. I would be more concerned if my boss tried to say that he or she knew everything and could answer it off the top of their head, rather than being able to say, I'm not sure. Let me check on that. Let me find out about that. So as a leader, it's not reasonable to think, whatever the job title is, that you can be an HR expert, that you can be a legal analyst, that you can be a counseling professional. That's not, that should not be the expectation. And sometimes leaders put that on themselves, that they feel that they should know all those things. And the message that I try to share is reach out for help. Don't be uncomfortable in reaching out for help.
Right. Just sage words, really important words for particularly folks who are contemplating roles of leadership or are in roles of leadership right now and are looking to get better. Reach out for help, and that's a wonderful segue into the last thing I want to ask you is, how do people reach out to get help if they want to get help from Dr. Ed Sherman? How would they do that?
Yeah, so I love to connect with people. I'm a networker. I am a collaborator. So I love to hear what things people are working on and what's going on in the various fields of public safety and public sector and in all places in the work world. So please feel free to contact me. The best way is by email. That is ed@shermanconsulting.org. And I'm also on LinkedIn at Dr. Ed Sherman. I'd be very happy to hear from you in either of those places.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Ed, for the opportunity to chat with you for a while. It's been illuminating. Yeah, and again, appreciate the trips back on the Wayback Machine as well. So again, we certainly appreciate your contributions. And if you're watching this episode on the Flourish DX YouTube page, please do like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you're watching or listening to this podcast for the first time, welcome. I hope something that you've heard will motivate you to come back and listen in or watch us again in the future. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychealthandsafetyusa.com. And please become a part of the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting to us on LinkedIn. That's it for this particular episode. We'll look forward to seeing and hearing from you next time on the next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much.
Tune in each Friday for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.